On August 28, 2003, at 2:28 in the afternoon, a man walked into a PNC Bank branch in Erie, Pennsylvania. He wore a white t-shirt, khaki cargo pants, and locked around his neck was a bomb. He handed the teller a note. It said he was under duress, that if they didn't give him $250,000, the device would detonate. He walked out with $8,702. What followed was one of the most bizarre, twisted, and deliberately cruel crimes in FBI history. A case so strange that when investigators first arrived on the scene, they didn't know if they were looking at a hostage situation, a bank robbery, or a murderer. The answer? It turned out it was all three. Brian Wells was 46 years old. He had worked as a pizza delivery driver for Mamma Mia's Pizzeria in Erie for years. By all accounts, he was quiet, unremarkable, the kind of man who blends into the background of a city. Someone you might pass on the street and never notice. He lived alone, he didn't make much money, he had a small circle of acquaintances rather than close friends, but people who knew him described him as gentle, non-threatening, not the kind of person who made enemies. On the afternoon of August 28, 2003, Brian received a pizza delivery order. The address was on Peach Street, out towards the TV transmission towers on the eastern edge of Erie. It was a strange location for delivery, but Brian took the order and drove out. But he never came back the same person. What happened at that transmission tower site is the central mystery of this entire case. What we know is this. At some point during that trip, Brian Wells had a metal collar fastened around his neck. A device shaped like a crudely engineered bomb, locked with a bolt that required a key to remove. At some point, he was handed a series of handwritten notes, instructions, like a scavenger hunt, a list of tasks he supposedly had to complete to receive a key. That would unlock the collar before a timer ran out. The first task on that list? Rob a bank. Specifically, the PNC Bank on Peachtree Street. Brian Wells walked into that bank, he handed the teller a note, and it read, "This is a robbery. I have a bomb strapped to my neck. I am not kidding. I am being forced to do this." The teller gave him $8,702, all the cash from her drawer. Brian left. He didn't get far. A dye pack hidden in the money exploded as Brian walked to his car, staining the bills red. He drove a few blocks before being pulled over by police. What the responding officers found when they approached the vehicle stopped them cold. There it was, around his neck, a heavy metal device, roughly clinical with what appeared to be a keyhole mechanism, connected to a timer visible on the front. Brian told officers he'd been forced, that he'd been held at gunpoint, that people he didn't fully know had locked the device on him. He said he had to complete a series of tasks or it would be detonated. He seemed confused and frightened, but there was something off about the scene that will haunt investigators for years. He was cooperative. He sat down when he was told to. He pointed at his neck. He said, "It's gonna go off. I'm not lying." For nearly 30 minutes, Brian Wells sat in that parking lot. Officers kept their distance. They were trained not to approach a potential IED. He sat there alone on the asphalt. At 3:18, less than an hour after he'd walked into the bank, the device detonated. The explosion was catastrophic. Brian Wells passed at the scene. The bomb squad arrived 3 minutes later. Investigators immediately began piecing things together. Brian left behind some notes, and they were extraordinary. So they laid out a scavenger hunt, a sequence of locations around Erie, Pennsylvania, each with a task Brian was supposed to complete to receive the next clue. The notes were handwritten, detailed, and clearly prepared in advance. Someone had put enormous effort into designing this game. The bomb itself was equally disturbing on inspection. It was a sophisticated device, not something assembled from a YouTube video. It had multiple components, a functional timer, and had clearly been constructed by someone with at least working knowledge of explosives. This wasn't a prop, but here's where the story fractures into two deeply uncomfortable situations. The first, Brian Wells was a completely innocent victim, a pizza delivery man lured to a remote location, taken hostage, fitted with a bomb against his will, and forced into a robbery he had no part in planning. A patsy who died for someone else's scheme. Now the second, Brian Wells knew more than he let on, that he was to some degree a willing participant in a plot that spiraled horribly out of his control. The truth, as the FBI would eventually conclude, is somewhere in the middle. Investigators traced Brian's delivery route back to its origin point, the TV transmission tower site off of Peachtree, and what they found there was significant. Evidence of recent activity, a note, and the beginning of a trail. The phone number used to place the delivery order was tracked. It led investigators towards a small, troubled world of people living on the edges of Erie's social landscape. People who knew each other, used each other, and ultimately destroyed each other. Two names emerged as central suspects. The first was Marjorie Armstrong, a woman in her mid-50s with a long history of mental illness, a volatile personality, and investigators would learn a motive: she needed money. Specifically, she needed to pay someone to off her elderly father so she could collect his inheritance before he spent it all. The second was Kenneth Barnes, a crack-addicted drifter and a small-time criminal, who claimed Marjorie had approached him with exactly that offer: money to off her father. Barnes told the FBI something crazy when they first interviewed him. He said Marjorie had needed money to pay him for the hit, and to get that money, she'd come up with a plan involving the pizza delivery man she knew. In order to understand this case, you have to understand Marjorie. She was, by any measure, a deeply troubled person. In 1984, her boyfriend was found deceased, and Marjorie claimed self-defense. She was acquitted. In 2003, the same year as the bank robbery, her boyfriend was found in the freezer in her home, shot in the head. Again, Marjorie claimed self-defense. She was convicted of third-degree murder in that case and sentenced to 7 years. She was still awaiting trial for that killing when investigators began building their bank robbery case against her. Investigators came to believe that she was the architect of the entire Wells scheme. She had designed the scavenger hunt. She had arranged for the bomb. She had, with Kenneth Barnes, lured Brian Wells out to the tower site. But what was Brian's role? Kenneth Barnes, the key cooperating witness against Marjorie, told FBI investigators that Brian Wells was not an unwilling victim. According to Barnes, Brian knew about the plot in advance. He had agreed to participate, to walk into the bank with the bomb collar on, collect money, and then have the device removed. The plan, as Brian supposedly understood it, was that the collar was fake, a prop, a way to convince bank tellers that the robbery was real. If that account is true, then Brian Wells died because he trusted people who used him and disregarded him. He thought he was wearing a theatrical prop. He was wearing a live bomb. He was, in the cruelest possible sense, a pawn, someone brought into a conspiracy under false pretenses, expendable to the people who designed the plan. The FBI ultimately concluded that Brian Wells likely had some foreknowledge of the robbery, but the full truth died with him in the parking lot. The bomb itself led investigators to a third figure in the conspiracy, a man named Floyd Stockton. Stockton was a convicted felon with ties to both Marjorie and Barnes. He was suspected of being the individual who actually constructed the device. He, however, cooperated with federal authorities. He received immunity in exchange for his testimony. This is perhaps the most controversial aspect of the case's legal outcome. The man who had built the weapon that killed Brian Wells walked free in exchange for helping convict Marjorie Armstrong. Many have questioned whether justice was truly served, whether the full weight of accountability landed on all the right people who deserved it. Marjorie was indicted on federal charges in 2007, 4 years after Brian Wells' death. The case had taken that long to build. Her trial began in 2010. It was, by any account, a spectacle. On November 1st, 2010, Marjorie Armstrong was convicted of armed bank robbery, conspiracy, and using a destructive device in a violent crime. She was sentenced to life in federal prison plus 30 years. She would never leave prison. Marjorie died in custody in April 2017 at the age of 68. She maintained her innocence to the end. Kenneth Barnes pleaded guilty and received a 45-year sentence.